begin talking about your book, I wanted to know if you can tell us a little bit more about your personal and academic background.
Sure. My family is Ethiopian, and I was born in Addis Ababa and grew up in Ethiopia and then in Botswana. So I lived on the African continent for most of my childhood and moved to the US right at the beginning of high school, which also was 2001. So we moved in August 2001 to Arlington, Virginia, and 9/11 happened like my second week of school and my first month in the United States. I think one sort of formative kind of personal political experience for me is that my whole time in the United States has been lived in the shadow of kind of a resurgent American imperialism.
The next question kind of leads into that in more depth. What inspired you to write this book?
Mm-hmm. So I think for many people, the thought was that Obama's election would kind of pull us back from the brink of endless wars we had been in, but obviously that was not the case, right? So there was this kind of persistence, and a persistence that I thought was really related to the waning and the kind of undermining of these concepts of the mid-20th century, particularly sovereign equality. And then on the academic side, I think especially among political theorists who were interested in theorizing a post-Westphalian world order, who were interested in cosmopolitanism, there was a kind of normative celebration of the fact that something like sovereign equality was waning. So there's this kind of weird disjuncture in which in the real world, what this is enabling isn't cosmopolitanism, but new forms of empire. But in the academic world, as kind of celebration of this as in the moment that we transcend the nation state form. So I think that was sort of one kind of debate I was interested in. And I thought, in particular, so much of that literature on cosmopolitanism really stems from the European experience of the post-war period. So it takes the kind of crisis of World War II, the crisis of the Holocaust, as the site and space from which to think what a cosmopolitan order requires. And so the kind of nation state as a problem, really, that's the focus of that literature. And obviously that was not the experience of most of the world. Most of the world didn't suffer from excessive sovereignty, around the end of World War II. So I think thinking about a different genealogy of internationalism was one inspiration from that perspective. And then, as I said, I was really inspired by a lot of work done on Black internationalism, especially in the 20s and 30s. So Michelle Stevens' book, Black Empire, Brent Hayes Edwards' book, The Practice of Diaspora, which really focuses on Black intellectuals and activists and artists, writers of the 1920s and 30s and the kinds of transnational connections they built with each other. So I was really fascinated by these histories, but I wanted to tell the story of internationalism during the age of decolonization. What happens when empire is coming to an end? How do these projects of internationalism live on in that period? So those two kinds of questions and influences shaped the kind of formulation of the book.
You use the term worldmaking, both in the title of your book and frequently throughout. Why do you think it's important to conceptualize decolonization as a project of worldmaking?
I use the concept worldmaking, or the idea of worldmaking, alongside and in juxtaposition to nation building. And I think often we think of decolonization as this moment of transition, where we go from a world of empire to a world of nation states. And we think of the kind of protagonists of decolonization, anti-colonial nationalists, is engaged in this project of making new nations. So world making for me was, on the one hand, an attempt to capture the kind of global dimensions of their thinking, the ways that they thought national independence couldn't be secured really at the level of just the domestic. But if you were going to have national independence for these colonies, you would have to reimagine the world altogether. For the set of thinkers I'm interested in, they conceive of empire not simply as a relationship between country A and country B, but that empire was a structure that made the modern world in its totality. So empire itself was a world-making project.
In the book, you write about the concepts of racial hierarchy and uneven integration at the international level. So why is it important to interrogate these terms into studies of political theory and international relations?
As I mentioned, I think when we tell the story of decolonization as a story of nation building, we often think empire was really a structure of alien rule. So again, that one country rules another country, and that the colonized country in this case is excluded from the international order. So we think that the challenge on the international level is just to expand the boundaries of the international order so that colonies can gain inclusion as members of the international society. What I try to show, especially in the first substantive chapter, is empire wasn't only a structure that applied to colonies that were directly under foreign domination, but a broader structure that implicated even countries that were independent. So here I use the example of Ethiopia and Liberia just to dramatize this question of unequal integration. We have these two countries who are independent, who are recognized as independent and sovereign, who are members of the League of Nations, so technically have equal standing in the international order. But yet they experience what I call a burdened form of membership in that international society. And they are subject to a racial hierarchy. So then I make a second point about racialization of this structure of unequal integration that I really trace to the late 19th century and then into the 20th century. And here, others have documented this, say, with the rise of scientific racism, with social Darwinism. You get a much more naturalized conception of racial hierarchy and racial difference that comes to dominate in this period. This coincides with emancipation in the Americas, but that does free the enslaved, but of course leads to various forms of subordinated standing and second-class citizenship, and it coincides with the scramble for Africa. So there is this kind of racialization of sovereignty itself, and Blackness and Black sovereignty comes to name a particularly impossible position, an unavailable status. And that would be the experience of Ethiopia and Liberia in the League of Nations.
So what have been the various meanings of self-determination in the history of international relations? And what role does this concept play in your book? What does the term self-determination mean today?
That's great. So, that the principle of self-determination is often connected to the same period of the League of Nations, and it's associated with the liberal internationalism of Woodrow Wilson, that there ought to be the consent of the governed ought to be kind of a principle of the international order. One thing I try to show is that for Wilson and for Jan Smuts, the South African statesman with whom he was in close conversation and communication about the structure of the League of Nations, both of them very, very explicitly insisted that self-determination was not a universal principle, that it could not in fact apply to the colonies, to Africans in particular, and that self-determination for them was a malleable principle, so that each society, based on their kind of developmental status, would have different forms of self-determination. So what the point of that is to say that the Wilsonian vision of self-determination was never a universal ideal, right? It was always a racialized conception of self-determination. The rest of the book then talks about like what anti-colonial nationalists do with the concept of self-determination. And in that moment, I think self-determination is associated with independence and equality in the international order. And what the book charts is different ways that we think of that, different ways that those figures thought about it. So the self-determination, for instance, has a legal dimension, and I describe that through the example of how the right to self-determination gets incorporated into the human rights covenants. And self-determination as a legal right guarantees all peoples the right to independence, and then it becomes the basis for making arguments for equal standing within international society. So by rejecting this idea that development or underdevelopment means you can't exercise self-rule, anti-colonial critics are able to create space for a kind of more substantive vision of equality and sovereign equality. You know, I think there are also important limits to this project that I describe. For instance, if you say all peoples have the right to self-determination, why does that apply at the level of the, you know, territorial boundaries of the colony rather than, say, at the subnational level? And of course, this generates a whole set of calls for secession, for autonomy within states. And I think this is one of the kind of important legacies of the concept of self-determination that has gotten picked up by especially indigenous scholars and indigenous movements around the world. I think you see a rich body of work that's trying to think about what self-determination means as claims of autonomy, as claims of self-rule, that's disconnected from necessarily an argument for separate statehood. So I think that's one of the ways in which that concept is being reimagined and reconsidered for our own times.
You're discussing a lot of different anti-colonial thinkers, and we're going to push you to discuss them in a little bit more depth if you're good with that. So I'm going to ask this question in a two-part format. So the first is drawing on some of the anti-colonial thinkers about, they imagined the global economy as a single economy unit, right? So sort of speak, to connect histories of development and underdevelopment together under one rubric. Can you elaborate a little bit on how they envision this single economy? And then we'll go to the second part of the question.
Sure. One thing I should say about the book, it's not an explicit structure, but there is a sort of generational structure to the book, namely that the figures I was mentioning a moment ago, Kwame Nkrumah and Eric Williams, they're both born around 1909, so and they come of age in the 30s, right? And they're the kind of constitute a first generation of anti-colonial thinkers. And has a vision of development that's very much a modernization model of an attempt to industrialize states like Ghana, to jumpstart post-colonial economies. Another reason why there's such investment in the strong state. Michael Manley and Julius Nyerere are born in the 20s, so they come of age really in the 50s, and they are in power at a later period, and they come in power at a moment in which there's already a crisis around that developmental vision, around whether kind of post-colonial states are going to be able to jumpstart their economies and, you know, follow the path of development. I mean, there's many versions of the crisis, but one version of the crisis is that the declining terms of trade, where post-colonial states are producing largely raw materials, and those raw materials are getting less and less money on the global arena. So this is a moment, I think, of real attempts to kind of rethink the project of development. It's not that Michael Manley and Julius Nyerere are not committed to the project of development, but they're trying to rethink what it requires. Manley calls it a democratic socialism. Julius Nyerere calls it an African socialism. Both of these kind of domestic visions of trying to secure equality are have to kind of grapple with the position of these states in the broader international economy. The way that they think about the global economy is to make the case that the position of post-colonial states within the international economy are basically have the same status as workers do in a domestic economy. So there's this kind of analogy between the international economy and the domestic economy.
The second part kind of connects to thinking of this as a viable political strategy today. So particularly here, thinking of the contemporary debates around reparations, increasing global inequality, and even something like global climate change. So how would their approach allow us to think about this today?
Great, yeah. All right, so I'll finish the thought. So the argument is that if the post-colonial states are the workers of the world, we can imagine that there's an international division of labor, and that they both kind of envision the new international economic order as something tantamount to what the welfare state was within the North Atlantic, right? The idea is that there will be class struggle of some kind on the international stage, and that the new international economic order is a bargain between the international classes, right? I think there's tons of problems with this analogy insofar as that it obscures domestic inequality, right? If the post-colonial state itself is the worker of the world, then the kind of actual workers of the world disappear from view, right? But again, I think it is a really productive way of thinking about the world that empire made, right? To think about the fact that actually the modern world we live in isn't one of kind of isolated nation states that are formed independent of each other and then come together to form an international society, but that the positions of these states, the legal, political, and economic positions of these states are actually co-constituted all the time. They're entangled with each other. I think this is especially important in the climate change kind of debates, because I mean, here's a very clear instance in which the industrialization, the consumption patterns of the North Atlantic have contributed incredibly to the crisis we find ourselves in, overwhelmingly to the crisis of climate catastrophe that we find ourselves on the brink of. Yet at the same time, it's likely going to be people in the third world who suffer the most from climate change, because they tend to live in places that are more vulnerable to climate change, because they won't have the infrastructure capacities to deal with the kind of onslaught of the crisis. I mean, the cyclones that hit Mozambique last year are really, exemplary of this. The hardest hit parts of Mozambique were just miles from where ExxonMobil is engaged in offshore drilling, right? And, Exxon made this kind of, donation to help with rebuilding efforts. And then there was this kind of hashtag that activists on the ground were using that was called, pay your climate debt. So I think it's a powerful way of viewing the world and viewing its interrelationship. Of course, the classic problem of the international is that there is no state, right? There's no kind of coercive structure that organizes the whole system. So where can you make this kind of claim, and how would you get people to pay their climate debt?
Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting, but also very insightful so far. So there is a melancholy tone in your book, particularly towards the end, when the new international economic order falls apart in the late 70s and the neoliberal counter-revolution takes hold from the 1980s on. Why do you think the anti-colonial world-making projects you write about in the book ultimately failed? Oh, that's a big question. What lessons of failure might we glean in the interest of pushing anti-colonial, anti-imperial world-making projects and solidarities in the future?
Yeah, I think the story of failure I want to tell is one that's it accrues over time, over the course of the narrative of the book, and it's one in which there are both internal crises in the projects, as I've begun to mention today, and then there's kind of obviously constantly external resistance and rejection of the project. So let me just talk about the internal part first. One, as we were saying earlier, this question about, well, who actually is the self in self-determination generates a whole series of conflicts within these societies, sometimes very violent conflicts. The Katanga secession in the Congo being a very early example of this. The Biafra War in the late 60s being another instance in which the claims of self-determination very quickly devolve into conflicts over who the self is that's going to gain self-determination. So I think in the context of this also, you see the kind of narrowing of the ambition of world making. Early post-colonial states, including Ghana, had constitutions that said they would give up sovereignty to a regional federation. But by 1963, when we get the Organization of African Unity, you have a kind of regional body that strengthens and reinforces state sovereignty. And then that organization, of course, very explicitly defends Nigeria in the context of that, if the Biafran bid for independence. So there's the kind of narrowing of the vision so that world making really just amounts to defending the rights of the nation state. And then I think by the 1970s, many of these states are, or at least a big chunk of these states are highly repressive internally, right? I think one of the ironies about that, of course, is that it was working class politics and trade unionism in particular that had been in the 30s and 40s the kind of space from which national independence appeared. It also then helps to facilitate critics from the outside, right? Critics who had been from the 50s opposed to the right to self-determination, right? Who had already been pointing out the kind of that, you know, self-determination didn't guarantee individual rights, that the self of the self-determination was undetermined. It helps to galvanize this set of critics who begin to articulate that this project of anti-colonial world making is a kind of hypocritical project, that its vision of international equality doesn't really apply domestically. So I think that's one story. That's the ideological story about how it ends. I think there's a kind of material question also, that when the debt crisis begins to take off beginning in Jamaica in 77, whatever limited bargaining power they did have in the 60s and early 70s, the material grounds of that bargaining power are completely undermined as the debt crisis unfolds.
Thank you for your generosity and time. That was a very, very illuminating interview. We'll let you go with just one last question. Where do you see your work going now? What is your focus now as a researcher?
My focus now, I feel like every kind of theorist, historian who works on decolonization always moves back to a happier time, or like a time that feels like it was more open. So I'm working on the 1920s and 30s, and I'm particularly focusing on the Garveyite movements. And for me, it's also an opportunity to think more about grassroots popular politics and the popular politics of Pan-Africanism. I feel like one kind of limit of my book that I feel very strongly is that it was a book about really high politics. It focused on statesmen and kind of felt very disembodied from, you know, grassroots politics. So that's what I hope to do in the next book.